Well, this morning we continue in a sermon conversation called Let's Go Swimming. Who's been swimming already since the weather has gotten uncomfortable around here? Yes. Well, we're going to trace the steps of this community, the Israelite community, through the early parts of Joshua as they leave their wilderness and they begin to claim their promised land. And Cindy started our conversation last week about jumping off the ledge. And so today we're going to talk about this concept of floating, and we'll continue to trace this family's journey. When I think of floating and I think of Joshua 2, the first thing I think of is baseball. How about that? Did you catch that one? I feel like that was coming. Actually, I think about throwing a baseball. And one of the things that I've enjoyed so far this summer is watching my son Ezra in his first season of T-ball, learning how to catch and throw a baseball. And something that I've seen is that whenever Ezra barely thinks about what he's doing, he can throw the perfect baseball back to me. In fact, he puts this gnarly spin on his throw that has got me so excited as a dad who loves baseball, because at some point he's going to add some velocity to that gnarly spin, and it's going to be an insane curveball, and everyone's going to be fooled by it, and he's going to be a major league pitcher, and he's going to be able to allow me to retire early and all those things. But what I've noticed is if he thinks about it too much, if he's too deliberate with his step, if he has his eyes begin to cast everywhere, and if he tightens his arm up trying to throw it real hard, there's no telling where that baseball is going to go. And it's not just him as a 5-year-old learning how to play the game, but even adults just picking up a baseball and thinking about it too much causes so many problems for something that could be so simple to do. I actually retrieved a YouTube video of the 10 worst first pitches ever thrown in the beginning of a Major League Baseball game, and celebrities and former baseball players alike are on this top 10 list. Can you go ahead and roll that video for us this morning? This is Carly Rae Jepsen, and you can't even see where that one went, actually. The next one, this is Carl Lewis, many gold medals in track and field, not so much in first pitches. Watch this one. Yikes. How many bounces does it take to get to home plate, right? All right, this next one is a politician, a former mayor of Cincinnati, throwing it to a dugout. And he gets thrown out of the game for it. This is Michael Jordan, his airness, who had a minor league baseball career, throwing an opening pitch. This is what happens when you got a little nervous about throwing a baseball. I don't think we can call him the GOAT any longer. That was way too high and outside. Okay, we go to the next one. This is former President Barack Obama. He put on a White Sox hat. That was the problem. He shouldn't have done that. And he throws his first pitch way high in the air, almost over the catcher's head, right? Not so bueno. Okay, this is Nolan Ryan. He is a Hall of Fame pitcher. And he goes back to his mound where he's been before in street clothes, and watch what happens. Scary sighting, way outside. Something that he's done a million times before, couldn't do on that specific day. I'm not sure exactly who this is. Doesn't matter. It was a terrible first pitch. We get to 50 Cent. This is 50 Cent. Rapper, watch where this goes. I mean, you have to try to throw it that terribly. John Wall, great point guard for the Washington Wizards. Look at that, bounce pass in baseball. Yes. But the best one, and last but certainly not least, a beauty queen from Texas. What in the world is she doing? What is she doing? And what are the Texas Rangers doing, allowing something like that to happen, right? So not just for a T-baller, but even for adults, you think about it too much, something that should be straightforward doesn't happen. How about a third case? This is, Exhibit C. This is John Lester, the ace for the now world champion Chicago Cubs. It's very tough to say that as a Brewers fan. He's the ace on the team, the first one in the rotation. Batters fear him in his left arm because he can throw an amazing fastball. He has a deceptive curveball. By the age of 30, he had several world championships, and he beat cancer once again before the age of 30. But he's developed an interesting condition as a baseball player. If a ball is bunted in front of him or if someone barely hits it and he has to field the ball to try to throw it to first, something happens in his brain that when he has to turn it 90 degrees to throw to first base, all of a sudden he has forgotten how to throw to first base. He has this is a very technical term, sports psychologists call the yips. You can Wikipedia that thing. It comes right up with a great write-up about it. So anytime he turns, once again, 90 degrees to his left to try to make an out at first, it either goes too high or it bounces several times before it gets to first base. It goes all the way to the right, all the way to the left. There's even been a couple of times where he's so scared to throw it that he's tucked the baseball into his glove. Let's be reminded, he gets paid millions of dollars to make a simple throw, and he throws his whole glove with the baseball in it to the first baseman to catch it so that the runner is tagged out in time. Once again, something so straightforward and something that you learn as young as possible becomes so difficult if we overthink it, if we don't allow ourselves to trust our muscle memory. It got me thinking about the Christian life. I think that at times as Christians we have the spiritual yips, things that should be straightforward for us to consider, but because we overthink it or try way too hard, these simple tasks become very difficult to accomplish and to fulfill. So this morning we're going to trace the walkway of a couple of characters from Joshua chapter 2, and hopefully as we look at their life, we can look at our life, and perhaps we can overcome the spiritual yips that we might have. In Joshua chapter 2, Joshua, like the new leader of Israel, unlike Moses before him, when it's time to come into the promised land, instead of sending 12 spies, he only sends 2. He says there's better odds if we only send 2 instead of 12 like the last time. And so he sends spies into the promised land, and he says specifically, I want you to go to the town of Jericho. So we see in Joshua chapter 2, verse 1, that the spies are sent into the promised land. They go to Jericho, and they go to a certain person's home, a person named Rahab, who's a prostitute, and they stay there. Now, word gets out to the king of Jericho that there are spies in his city, so he goes to all the places where they might stay. He gets the Airbnb list of Jericho, and he begins to go from place to place. He goes to Rahab's house, and he demands that if she knows where these spies are, that she should turn them over. She lies to the soldiers of the king of Jericho, and she hides the spies in the roof of her home. It's already an interesting twist in the story. She doesn't know these spies. They don't know her. They're strangers in this scenario. But for whatever reason, she decides to hide them in her rooftop. Not only does she hide them there, but they begin to have a conversation after the soldiers leave. And she says, they're going to come back around. They're going to come looking for you. I want you to go for 3 days out just outside the city, find a cave, and for 3 days hide until they're completely gone. Then you can go back where you came from. So you can imagine these spies. They don't know this woman, and she doesn't know them. And they're taking orders from her. They're hiding in her rafters. They're perhaps looking at each other going, this is ridiculous. Why are we doing this? You can imagine the multiple conversations they're having in the cave just outside the city limits as they begin to ask one another, should we trust the wisdom from this stranger? So they're floating in their trip to Jericho as spies. They're waiting on their next direction. To do something more than wait would to put them into harm's way, so their best course of action is to float and to wait. But they're not the only ones who are floating in this story, because as they're talking about what's going to happen when the rest of the Israelites come over the Jordan River and into their territory, Rahab begins to ask them for help. She says, I've heard of the fame of your nation. I've heard the fame of your God. If you would see it in your heart, to have mercy upon myself and my family, it would do me great joy. And so in verse 14, these outsider Jewish spies cut a deal with a stranger they've never met before. And they promise her that if she ties a cord on the window of her home, that when the army comes in, that anyone in her home would be spared. And so as they go away and as they join their people and as Rahab is waiting for this all to go down, you can imagine the sleepless nights. You can imagine the pacing in her home, wondering if these strangers that she knew for a moment are going to fulfill her promise. The promise that they gave, this deal that they cut with her for their own safety, would she be safe as well? So everyone is floating in this story. But something different is going on if we go just underneath the surface. Because you can imagine that these spies are being impressed upon themselves what they should do, what they should expect when they go into this new territory. We know that they've been wandering around the wilderness for 40 years. So perhaps these spies grew up in the wilderness wondering what's going to happen when we cross over to the other side. You can imagine that as they go from campsite to campsite in the wilderness over those 40 years, and as they set up dinner tables and as they had campfires at night, that the parents of these spies began to train them and impress upon them a worldview because of the stories that they would tell. They would tell these great stories of their past because they were wondering what their future was going to be. And you can imagine that one of these stories that they told again and again and again were some of these stories from the early parts of Genesis, where their story began, including a curious story from Genesis chapter 9. In this story, one of the heroes of the faith, Noah, was on the ark waiting out a storm from God as God flooded the earth. And after that flood and the waters subsided, the boat found a place to land, and the animals came out of the boat, and Noah and his 8 family members came out, and they began to start all the way over after the flood waters had receded. And we hear in Genesis chapter 9, the first thing that Noah did was to make a vineyard and to make some wine. That's the first thing that he did. And Genesis 9 says that he overdid it one night, and he passed out in his tent. He didn't have any clothes on, and he wasn't covered. And so what happens next is really interesting, and there's probably some other details that are left out for the sake of the younger audience members as the story is being told. But one of his sons, named Ham, came into his tent and looked upon his father's nakedness, which was a shameful thing in this culture. And so he left the tent there, and he went to his brothers Shem and Japheth, and he told them what he had done. And so Shem and Japheth did the honorable thing. They got a blanket, and they posted it on their shoulders. They walked backward into the tent, and they covered their father's vulnerability. When Noah woke up from his slumber, he walked right past Ham, who committed the offense, and he went to Ham's son Canaan. And we see in Genesis chapter 9, verse 25, Noah cursed Canaan. He said this, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves, who will be to his brothers." What's interesting about this story is that Canaan had a large family, which turned into a large nation. And the group of people in which the city of Jericho was resided in was the community of the Canaanites. So you can imagine, as these spies were growing up and hearing these stories, they had an embedded ideology about Canaanites. You can imagine the disdain and the hatred and the narrow-mindedness that they had about all these people. And so isn't it interesting that as they go into the land of Canaan with all these narratives and all these perspectives about the Canaanites, the first one that they meet is a woman who's actually kind to them, who risks her life for their sake. That just like Japheth and Shem, she covered them over instead of exposing them to the soldiers that came. What's interesting is that the people of Israel, as they walked through the wilderness and hearing these stories, they felt like all Canaanites were going to act like Ham, but here Rahab is acting more like the wise brothers of Ham and not Ham himself. So this floating that the spies are called to is not just a practical floating. It's not just to rescue their life, but it's an ideological floating as well. The data that they were handed early in their life wasn't mixing with their common experience, and so they had a decision to make. Will we go with this new piece of information, or will we trust the thing that we've always known? Can you imagine their conversations in the rooftop? Can you imagine their conversations in the cave? That back and forth, they must have said, "Are you serious? Are we actually going to cut a deal with the Canaanite?" What's important about floating is that it gives us the opportunity to have a mid-course correction when the game changes. When we decide to float, when that's the best course of action, what we're saying is we're not completely there yet, but we're still needing to learn something new. And so we take those opportunities when the story changes, not to be closed-minded, but to be open-minded, to take a step back and to take a breath and say, "God, this is new. I wasn't expecting this, and I'm not going to hurry to find an answer. What would you like to teach me in this moment?" To be honest, floating is the very contents of the faithful life. You and I didn't become Christians because it would make our lives easier. I remember becoming a Christian at the age of 15, and I remember some of my friends trying to convince me to become a Christian. They said, "It's going to make your life so much easier." They're liars. And if I could face them again, I would say, "You're liars. It's the greatest life I could ever think of living, but you lied to me. It's not easier, but it is deeper, and it is fuller, and it is the life that is truly life." The claims of Christianity doesn't make life simpler. It actually makes life a bit more challenging. But what it's also is to us, it's honest. That when times of floating, the opportunities of floating come upon us, the Christian faith is training us to take a breath and to be still. This idea of floating reminds me of a quotation. My favorite one's from Søren Kierkegaard, a famous Danish philosopher. He said, "The task of Christianity must be made difficult, for only the difficult inspires the noble-hearted." Søren Kierkegaard says, "My only aim in life is to make Christianity hard again." And that's the honest truth. If we actually take the claims of Christianity seriously, forgiving one another, loving our neighbors, there's nothing simple about that. But there's something deeply true about Christianity. And these moments of floating remind us that what we're called to as Christians is not the easy road, the easy life, but sometimes the hard road and the difficult seasons of life. I mean, imagine it. Every time that Jesus asked somebody in the Gospels to come follow him, the response is not, "Jesus, I'm so glad that somebody finally gave me an easy and logical and typical and expected rationale for life. Thank you for being that one who gave me the most straightforward way to live." Now, every time Jesus gave an invitation for someone to follow him, they said, "I've got to think deeply about this." Every time Jesus said, "Come follow me," it wasn't a gasp of relief. It was a gulp of sobriety. Everyone had to weigh the cost. They had to wipe their brow because what Jesus was calling them to wasn't the easy task, but the challenging task. Where seasons of life that you and I would have to float instead of always feel like it's going to be easy, standing in the shallow end of life's pool. Even Jesus, as he's dying on the cross, all of his faithful ones had abandoned him. And his opponents were hailing curses at him over and over again. He was left there by himself. Even in that low moment, he feels the silence of the Father. But it's there that he doesn't retaliate, that he doesn't seek to find another way. But on the cross, Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." What Jesus is doing on the cross is the greatest cosmic float task that any of us could ever imagine for a human being. How can we think that it's going to be different for us who are claiming to be learners and followers of Jesus? We will be called to float again and again in life. Some of us are parents, and we're trying to do our best to be godly parents, and we've come to this age of some of our children's childhood called the teenage years, where all rationality is thrown out the window. And the plan that we had before that used to work doesn't seem to work today. And so we're looking to God and saying, "God, I need some helper because I have no idea how to lead my teenagers. They're different human beings than they were yesterday." It's in that moment that Jesus is calling us to float. Some of us are on the opposite end of that spectrum. We have aging parents, and we're lightly suggesting that they begin to alter their living experience, and they're not having any of it because they feel like they're completely capable of doing life as business as usual. And so we have this tug and war with our parents and this interesting role reversal where it's now time for us to take care of them, and we're not exactly sure how to conduct the next steps forward. And so we're floating in the water, and we're asking God for some direction on what we should do next. Some of us are working in a workplace and there are less and less Christians around. And so we used to have a couple of people that we work with where we could talk about our church experience. We could talk about what's going on in our faith life. But we seem to be surrounded by people who have complete disdain or have this, they're just completely not interested in Christianity. And so we're tempted to just go away in our Christian bubble and to ignore them. But what we're being asked to do is to stay with them and with our neighbors who may not know Christianity. Instead of avoiding them and walking around the block, but to seek God and say, "God, what is your wisdom in this moment? I don't want to move to another house. I don't want to take a different job. I don't want to retire early. But how can I be faithful to these people around me again and again and again?" We're asked to float. And we're tempted just to parent harder, aren't we? To be more aggressive with that teenager who doesn't seem to be listening to us. Or we're tempted to evangelize harder in our workplace, where every piece of paper and everything on our walls is dripping with Jesus, so that anytime somebody comes in, they have 15 Bible verses slamming into their peripheral vision and to Jesus juke them in every single conversation that we have. Sometimes in these moments, though, these moments of in-between, if we parent harder, if we evangelize harder, it's like holding an object that's a bit elusive. If we tighten our grip, we actually have a weaker handle on it. In the same way, we have to listen to Jesus. Perhaps it's time for us to take a deep breath. And like the spies and the raptors and the spies in the cave and Rahab who paces her house every single night, maybe we need to convince ourselves that this is not going to go away tomorrow, but we need to be patient. And as we wait in patience, God begins to deliver exactly what we need at exactly the right time, because his ways are certainly higher than our ways. It reminds me of my friend who had a dad who learned to swim late in life. His kids were beginning to take swimming lessons, and his dad knew that they were going to begin to go to these different vacation locations where there was going to be swimming, and he didn't want to miss out on this wonderful space of life where he was swimming with his kids. And so after a few weeks of dragging his feet on it, he decided to call his kids' swim instructor and to organize an individual and private, very private appointment, because he was embarrassed that he didn't know how to swim at his age. And so he assumed that when he got to the pool, and however long it took him to get inside the pool because he was nervous, that he was going to go into the shallow end with the swim instructor, and he was going to be lightly guided into the deeper parts of the pool as he learned to swim in the shallow end. But when the swim instructor saw him, he dragged him by the arm, ever so slightly, to the deep end of the pool. And he said, "This is what's going to happen. I know that you're terrified to swim, but you're going to jump into the deep end of the pool. And as you could tell, this is 8 feet in its depth. You will not be able to touch the bottom of this pool when you jump in." My friend's dad, his chest began to tighten, and he began to look for the exits, began to size up. I think I'm a bit stronger than this swim instructor, and he wanted to run away. But the swim instructor said this: all I want you to think about is 3 things. When you jump in the water, you're going to seek, you're going to go under. All I want you to do is take a big breath in. Take a deep breath in. The second thing I want you to do is I want you to look up towards the sun. And the third thing I want you to do is to extend your arms. If you do those 3 things, you're going to be fine. And so after what seemed like 30 minutes of rationalizing, computing, waiting on the side, my friend's dad jumped in, and he did those 3 things. He took a deep breath in. He looked up towards the sun, and he extended his arms. And he said the craziest sensation happened. It felt like 1,000 hands were pushing him to the top of the water ever so gently. It was one of the most exhilarating experiences of his life. In the same way, you and I are trying to tread water in a very difficult and challenging issue. We're afraid that if we give up or if we don't continue with our aggressive pace that we're going to sink. Perhaps the wisdom that we need to hear from God this morning is that we need to take a deep breath in. We need to look towards the sun. And we need to extend our hands in submission. Allow the 1,000 hands of God's care to gently take us to the surface of the water. And there, learn how to float. I pray that you and I would seek such a way forward this morning in any area that might be weighing us down with anxiety and dread.